Also, envelope of motion. By definition, meaning volume of space within which all movement of one specific point of mandible occur. It is a combination of three plane, sagittal, horizontal, and frontal of mandibular border movement. It represents the maximum range of movement of mandible. Let's elaborate the movement of each mandible by each plane.
Now, let us look from the frontal view. Maximum movement of the mandible in frontal view is shield shape. Focus on the pinpoint. The mandible starts at the intercuspal point. The mandible is then moved laterally to the right side from the resting point, forming the right lateral superior border. The mandible then opens as wide as possible and is recorded as the right lateral opening border. As seen on the video, as the jaw moves inferiorly from the maximal lateral extend position, it will move medially towards the median sagittal plane. The mandible starts at the intercuspal position again. The mandible is then moved laterally to the left side from the intercuspal position, forming the left lateral superior border. The mandible then opens as wide as possible and is recorded as left lateral opening border. As seen on the video, as the jaw moves inferiorly from the maximum lateral extend position, it will move medially towards the median sagittal plane. Now we will look at the horizontal plane. The mandible is in the most retruded position. The mandible moves to the left until it extends maximally, forming the left lateral border. Then, from that position, the mandible is protruded, forming the continued left lateral with protrusion. Start again from the beginning. The mandible is in the most retruded position. The mandible moves to the right until it extends maximally, forming the right lateral border. Then, from that position, the mandible is protruded, forming the continued right lateral with protrusion. The movement is combined to form the rhomboid-shaped pattern movement of the horizontal plane. Last is from the sagittal plane. Generally, the sagittal plane border have three borders, which is the posterior opening border, anterior opening border, and the superior opening border. Let's start from the posterior opening border. The mandible is in the most retruded position. The mandible moves inferiorly until no further movement can be achieved without moving the condyle. The movement is limited by the temporomandibular ligament. Then, the mandible is then continued to move inferiorly towards the maximal opening by translating the condyle anteriorly and inferiorly. This opening from the retruded position forms the posterior opening border. The movement is limited by the capsular ligament. Next, let's look at the anterior opening position. From the previous position, the mandible is maximally open. The closure of the mandible towards the maximal protrude position forms the anterior opening border. Finally, is the superior border. This movement is determined by the characteristic of the teeth. From the maximal protruded position of the mandible moves posteriorly until it encounters the teeth. When the teeth are encountered, the mandible moves downwards slightly and continues to move posteriorly until it passes the teeth. The mandible closes again and moves posteriorly until it reaches the most retruded position.
Mastication is made up of rhythmic and well-controlled separation and closure of maxillary and mandibular teeth. Mastication of soft food involves opening and closing phase. Closing phase consists of two subphases, which are crushing phase on working side and grinding phase of working side. Let's look at the opening phase. Mandible droops down from intercuspal position to one point where incisor edge of teeth is approximately 16 to 18 mm apart. Mastication of soft food causes mandible to be lowered with initial slower stage followed by faster stage. Closing phase. Work is done against gravity. It moves the mandible upward and outward from open position to closing movement. This will bring the teeth into initial contact of food. Mandible further move laterally 5 to 6 mm from midline as closing movement begins. Mastication of soft food produces little resistance to jaw closure. This causes closing of mandible to have large or fast closing phase. Crushing phase on working side. As teeth approach each other, lateral displacement is lessened. The jaw occupies position 3 to 4 mm lateral to starting position of chewing stroke when teeth are only 3 mm apart. Upward and outward movement of mandible from open position will bring buccal cusp of maxillary and mandibular teeth in contact. Elevator muscles such as masseter, vertical fibers of temporalis and medial pterygoid muscle contact on both sides of jaw. Vertical movement of mandible will crush most of food and trap bolus between the teeth. Grinding phase of working side. Mandibular teeth slide medially against maxillary teeth. The mandible is guided by occlusal surface of teeth back to intercuspal position. The cuspal inclines of teeth pass across each other and cross depression with opposing occlusal surface. The ridges of lobes, cusp shears and grind the bolus. Mandibular teeth continue downwards and inward against maxillary teeth. Cycle is repeated until food is broken down small enough for swallowing.
The example of the hard food is kacang nicks. During the opening phase, the mandible drops down from the intercuspal position and the mandible is opened by constant fast velocity when eating hard food. During the closing phase, the closing of the mandible occurs with initial fast stage followed by slower stage. This is due to the resistance caused by the hard food. The upward and outward movement of the mandible from the open position bring the buccal cups of the maxillary and mandibular teeth in contact, which is called the buccal phase. The hard food is crushed and pierced between the teeth without direct tooth-to-tooth contact. As you can see in the video, there is more lateral closure stroke and more chewing strokes needed before swallowing is initiated. The cycle is repeated until the food is broken down small enough for swallowing.
Now, this is the process of the chewing of chewy food.